How many do you think?
I would be very surprised, as would pretty much everyone I've spoken to with any knowledge of this case, if it was not in the hundreds, multiple hundreds.
Why would a nurse, whose job it was to care for babies, murder and harm them in the hospital where she worked?
He discovered that the insulin level was not 500, but it was 47,000, which was the second highest ever recorded in the world.
Most nurses are nothing short of heroes. They save lives and care for vulnerable babies when their families can't. However, some nurses were at the opposite end of the spectrum. They were evil and demented and used their job to fulfill their darkest desires. Here are 3 of history's most shockingly evil nurses.
Lucy Letby was entrusted to protect some of the most vulnerable babies. In her hands, innocuous substances like air, milk, or medication like insulin would become lethal.
On July 3rd of 2018, 28-year-old Lucy Letby opened her door to an officer.
Oh, Lucy, is it?
Yes.
Hello, my name's Chester, please. Please step in 2 seconds.
Mere seconds later, Lucy was escorted out in handcuffs and charged with 8 counts of homicide and 6 counts of attempted murder. It had taken 2 years to arrest Lucy since her colleagues at the Countess of Chester Hospital started signaling an alarming rate of infant deaths. Then it took another 4 years to put her behind bars. Meanwhile, she was able to keep working at the hospital between her many arrests and interrogations. The reality of her stint at the Chester Hospital in the UK is nothing short of shocking. Lucy Letby was born in 1990 in Herefordshire, UK, the only child of Susan and David. Growing up, she had all the support and attention a child could get. Her parents were proud of her ambitious, career-driven personality. Lucy attended a comprehensive school in the area and then went on to get her pediatric nursing degree in 2011. As a child, as well as an adult, her friends and acquaintances noticed the same thing. She was kind, polite, and friendly. No red flags whatsoever. One of Lucy's neighbors said, "I've seen her grow up. She seemed a lovely woman, so this news is deeply and utterly shocking. I can't fathom it." When you hear these stories of things, you always get 1 or 2 people saying, "I thought there was something fishy about them," but with Lucy, all you'll hear is positive things. Lucy led a typical social life, and her work colleagues, the other nurses and midwives at the Countess of Chester Hospital, described her as an exemplary, hardworking woman. Some described her as hardworking to an annoying extent, the kind that would offer to do other nurses' jobs even when they insisted it wasn't necessary. Lucy started working at the Chester Hospital in 2013. Quickly, she became the face of a fundraising initiative called Baby Grow. The hospital wanted to raise £3 million for a neonatal unit, and Lucy was the perfect employee to show in the papers. That angelic, goody two-shoes that would have people donate. The caption under her picture said, "My role involves caring for a wide range of babies requiring various levels of support. Some are here for a few days, others for many months, and I enjoy seeing them progress and supporting their families." But something was off about Lucy, and soon her colleagues would begin to take notice. In 2013, there were 2 infant deaths at the hospital. In 2015, when she came around, there were 8 deaths. Not only was this an abnormal number of unexplainable deaths, but the cause was disturbing too. The premature babies had collapsed with heart and lung failure, but were unusually impossible to resuscitate. As if that wasn't horrible enough, the deaths were really graphic too. The babies developed strange blotches on their arms and legs after the futile resuscitation attempts. At least one of these babies developed these blotches on the chest and abdomen as well. These were vulnerable babies, some of them admitted to the NICU in critical conditions. So maybe it would make sense that not all would make it. But here's the thing, other babies had been admitted with a simple cold or a small allergy. Their cause of death and creepy blotches did not align with their medical history, and none of the deaths aligned with the baby's illnesses. By 2016, this was a nightmare for the hospital staff. Doctors and nurses dreaded receiving a call from the hospital. They knew it was about another baby who was fighting to live. And every time they tried resuscitating them, it went awry. There was another thing that happened every time a baby would pass away at the Chester Hospital. as the doctors began to notice. Lucy's name always came up.
The pediatricians were discussing, the terrible nights on call that they were having. One of them said, every time this is happening to me, that I'm being called in for these catastrophic events which were unexpected and unexplained, Lucy Letby is there.
But between these growing concerns and the actual time of Lucy's arrest were years of failed investigation attempts and deferrals by the hospital trust. In June 2015, 3 babies passed away at the Countess of Chester Hospital. The senior management spoke about launching an investigation into those deaths, but their plan never came to fruition. By October, 7 more babies had passed, and Lucy was seen in the room with every single one of them. However, as she wasn't the nurse in charge during all incidents, there wasn't sufficient evidence for the board to start an investigation. By February of the following year, another 3 lives were lost. The pediatricians were desperate at this point. They called an urgent meeting with the managers and requested that they discuss the infant deaths, as well as Lucy Letby. The managers, however, responded to their emails 3 months later. In June 2016, 2 more babies lost their lives over just 2 days. By September, the Royal College of Pediatrics and the Child Health officially requested an investigation into each of the 13 unexplained deaths. But that too was somehow forgotten. In May 2017, 2 years after the babies started dying under mysterious circumstances, the hospital trust phoned authorities and opened an investigation. Then it took another year to arrest Lucy, during which she still worked at the hospital. A former NHS whistleblower said that, sadly, this is not a unique case.
Not surprised at all. Trusts generally delay everything for as long as is possible. Now, what's fascinating here is that, like many NHS trusts in which tragedies have occurred, for different reasons, obviously to this specific case, you'll find that the prompts for action come from outside the system, because the system ignores its own people.
If it's good news, he says, even with lack of evidence, the management is quick to welcome it and use it for marketing purposes. But if it's bad news and there isn't strong evidence to back this up, they would rather turn a blind eye to it than risk the termination of the hospital or expensive lawsuits. In Lucy's case, if the trust decided to launch an investigation and Lucy was innocent, they risked a defamation lawsuit that could have cost them their entire business. If she was guilty, but they didn't have enough evidence to proceed, they could have started an investigation that dragged on for years, meanwhile tarnishing the hospital's reputation. Either way, it was a loss for the hospital. So they chose the risk of having more infants die over losing money. While the Countess of Chester Hospital was protecting itself, Lucy was unaliving more babies. The former chief executive of the hospital would eventually say, "I am truly sorry for what all the families have gone through. The trial and the lengthy police investigation have shown the complex nature of the issues raised. I will cooperate fully and openly with any post-trial inquiry." When Lucy was arrested, she acted seriously offended that a hardworking nurse like herself could be accused of such heinous acts. Her dramatic behavior could be seen in her texts, too. This is what she wrote to a fellow nurse after losing 2 babies in 2 days. "It wasn't a great start to the shift, but sadly it got worse. I'm struggling to accept what happened to baby Andy, and now we lost baby Charlie overnight, and it's just all a bit much. I know it happens, but it's still so sad and cruel, isn't it?" Disgustingly, Lucy used the deaths to get attention and even sympathy for going through the traumatic incidents. Lucy was arrested and sent home twice, as there wasn't enough evidence to link her to the deaths. Meanwhile, detectives gathered as many testimonies as they could, and the stories were truly sickening. Nurses complained that Lucy would casually drop in to see the babies on their shifts, even though she was assigned to other babies within the NICU, and even outside the unit. She would repeatedly do so, even when the nurses insisted she go back to her babies. Another nurse testified to a horrifying image. After one of the babies started flatlining, Their family was quickly called to the hospital. By the time they arrived, they were told there was nothing the hospital could do to save their life. So the parents cradled their baby one last time, trying to comfort each other through the heavy tears. The nurse saw Lucy watching them from a window down the hallway. The parents had noticed Lucy and were feeling deeply unsettled about this. So the other nurse asked Lucy to leave, but it almost seemed like she got off on it. And according to some parents, she got off on telling parents their babies did not make it too. She was just a tad too excited about being the bearer of bad news. Honestly, what is Lucy even like? How is this the same person that left a good impression on everyone who met her? How is this the person who chose the job of an NICU nurse?
Why would a nurse, whose job it was to care for babies, murder and harm them in the hospital where she worked?
Unlike her fellow nurses or doctors, Lucy had no family, children, or partner. She lived alone and, according to herself, had dedicated her entire life to taking care of babies. However, she had a baby room at home, even though she had no babies in the family. Lucy had picked up more shifts than other nurses. So when detectives asked her why she was always on shift when a baby passed, she said it was a simple odds game. She even raised her voice at the officers, saying the hospital was framing her to explain their incompetence. She was offended by how they all treated the nurse who worked the hardest. There was something else that did not help the investigation. The deaths could not be connected to a clear cause, and the cause could not be connected to Lucy. In other words, there was insufficient evidence to keep Lucy locked up. 3 days after her arrest in July 2018, she was released on bail. Lucy would be arrested and released one more time in 2019, then arrested for a third and final time in November 2020. As the detectives kept digging up on her, something else came up: her close relationship with an unnamed doctor in the hospital. Let's call him Dr. Z. These texts between Lucy and Dr. Z were found on Lucy's phone after her initial arrest. Lucy: we've lost 2 babies I was caring for, and now this happened today. Makes you think, am I missing something good enough? Doctor: Lucy, if anyone knows how hard you've worked over the last 3 days, it's me. If anybody says anything to you about not being good enough or performing adequately, I want you to promise me that you'll give my details to provide a statement. I don't care who it is, and I don't care if I've left the trust. Promise? Dr. Z seems determined to protect Lucy at all costs. Did he care for her more than he did his other nurses? Was there something between them outside of the fantasies in Lucy's head? Dr. Z even wrote this to Lucy: Doctor, you are one of the few nurses across the region, I've worked pretty much everywhere, that I would trust with my own children. Lucy: I don't know what to say. Thank you. Yeah, if only he knew who he was talking to. After analyzing 13 deaths and a dozen other near-death experiences at the hospital, authorities concluded that some of the babies were unalived by inserting air bubbles into their veins. Others passed after a feeding tube was shoved down their throats. Other times, huge amounts of insulin were added to the feeding tubes. This is what the chief said.
Lucille B was entrusted to protect some of the most vulnerable babies. In her hands, innocuous substances like air, milk, or medication like insulin would become lethal.
But the motive escaped anyone who knew Lucy, and Lucy wouldn't talk either. So it was down to the experts to speculate.
Sometimes the healthcare serial killer will say that I was actually being merciful. This person was in a great deal of pain, and I was just ending quickly.
But these babies were fighting for life, and some were not even in critical condition.
Other healthcare serial killers have often just wanted, because the unit is under such pressure, they just try to get rid of difficult patients. You know, we've cleared another bed.
Neither was the case for Lucy Letby. The final clue came when the detectives obtained a search warrant to her house. Inside her home, authorities found confidential patient records under her bed, which are of course illegal to take home. Detectives say they believe these records to be Lucy's trophies. Some serial killers keep parts of their victims at home. Lucy couldn't do that, so she resorted to the baby's files. Lucy also had stalked her victims' parents on Facebook. In 1 year, she had looked up babies' families 2,000 300 times. Lucy also had piles of notes scattered everywhere. In the notes, she complained about how she would never get married or have kids of her own, and described herself as an evil person. "I did this, and I killed them," was the closest thing to a confession the authorities got, but scribbled in uppercase letters on a sticky note. "I am evil. I did this. I killed them on purpose because I'm not good enough for them. I'm a horrible, evil person, and the world is better without me." Lucy's defense attorney claimed that this was not her open admission to unaliving the babies, but her interpretation of the guilt she felt from losing the babies during her shift. Sure. Lucy also had several scribbled notes on how much she adored Dr. Z. She had even written a little heart next to every single mention of his name. "Love, I trusted you with everything. One day I won't even think of you. I'm a failure though. Broken-hearted, killing me softly." The doctor was happily married and had children, but Lucy hated that. She wanted him for herself. Detectives speculated on a few potential motives. One is Munchausen by proxy. Lucy wanted the babies gone so she could text her coworkers and friends and complain about how rough her life was. She wanted to be comforted, like the babies she didn't want to comfort. She wanted constant attention, sympathy, and praise. Another theory is that Lucy's ultimate goal was to bond with Dr. Z and get him to leave his wife. By sharing experienced trauma, she could get his sympathy and get closer to him. Lucy Letby was found guilty of 7 counts of murder and 6 counts of attempted murder, and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Thankfully, she will never walk out of prison again. In March 1991, in Grantham, UK, 5-month-old Paul Crampton was suffering from a chest infection when his parents brought him in to Grantham and District Hospital.
He was described by the hospital staff as a happy wheezer, so of course we were concerned our child was in hospital, but we weren't worried. We certainly saw this as a precautionary matter. Paul was laid in the arms of a nurse. He was grey, clammy, cold.
He was quickly administered glucose and nursed back to miraculous health.
He had recovered from this hypoglycemic attack, and of course at that point my attention turned to why this had happened and what was the cause.
A few months later, 7-week-old Liam Taylor would pass away at the hospital. He also had been brought in with a chest infection.
He had showed signs of respiratory and cardiorespiratory difficulties, what we call acute collapse, totally unexpected.
2 weeks later, 11-year-old Timothy Hardwick was admitted to the hospital after having a seizure at school. A nurse asked her colleague, Nurse Beverly Allett, to take care of Timothy while she took care of another emergency. Beverly complied, but a few minutes later she shouted out to her colleagues there was a problem. Timothy had turned blue. Within seconds, he flatlined.
Often children who have a disability can have a shorter lifespan because of fits or because they get pneumonia or something like that.
Because of Timothy's severe disabilities, the hospital was not shocked by his death. However, the mysterious passings were adding up. As in Lucy's case, one name seemed connected to all. 5 days later, 15-month-old Katie B suffered a respiratory arrest. Within minutes, she was rushed to the Nottingham Hospital, where she made a surprising recovery. Around the same time, Paul Crampton suffered another attack and was rushed to Queen's Hospital. Concerned and frantic, Beverly Allett insisted she get in the ambulance with Paul. At this point, her fellow nurses and doctors were pitying her. What terrible luck to start your job and lose so many babies in just a few weeks, right? Beverly was born in October 1968 in rural Lincolnshire. Her family remembers her as a relentless attention seeker from day one.
She would cut herself on glass more often than anybody else. She would be going to hospital more often than anybody else.
She got off on having people sympathize with her. Poor Beverly, her family, friends, and boyfriends would say. But when Beverly got engaged to a man named Steve Biggs, Beverly subjected him to unspeakable abuse.
She humiliated him, she beat him up, she was aggressive.
Beverly became a textbook case of the Munchausen syndrome.
With Munchausen, the person will try and draw attention to themselves by causing themselves damage, which is what Beverly did. She injected herself, she cut herself, she did all sorts of strange things to herself.
Although Beverly struggled academically and barely passed nursing school, she landed herself a job at a severely understaffed hospital, the Grantham and District. She only had a 6-month contract here. This might explain her rush to take as many lives as she could in a short span of time. Perhaps she knew she would be fired by the end of the contract. The doctors were considering all scenarios: a new winter bug, faulty substances, or just bad luck. Mortality rates grow and decrease in waves. Perhaps it was a bad season, they thought. But when 9-week-old Becky Phillips passed away after another mysterious lung collapse, the hospital started asking more questions. Becky and her twin sister Kathy had been brought in with upset tummies. It was nothing life-threatening, and yet Becky died that day, and Katie suffered 2 respiratory arrests. As a consequence, she had permanent brain damage. Beverly seemed to go the extra mile to discover the issue. She was the one who saved Katie. Her parents thanked her for saving at least one of their babies. They even asked her to become her godmother. When Paul's tests came back from Queen's Hospital, it concluded there were abnormal amounts of insulin in his. On April 22nd, a 4th death devastated the hospital. 15-month-old Claire Peck, who had been admitted after an asthma attack. Seconds after she was left alone in a room with Beverly, Beverly called out to say she had stopped breathing and she could not be saved.
We couldn't believe she was gone.
We all started getting upset, waiting for someone to come out with some magic answers.
No one wanted to believe it, but by now, it could not be an odds game. Within 3 months, 4 babies had passed away, and over a dozen others barely survived collapses. On April 30th, an investigation was launched. When a forensics team looked through the stored blood samples in the fridge, they had a surprise.
She didn't clear the fridge very well, so we got in this freezer and we recovered 9 samples out of the 13 children that had been attacked.
He discovered that the insulin level was not 500, but it was 47,000, which was the 2nd highest ever recorded in the world.
All babies had shocking quantities of insulin in their blood. The investigation also concluded that Beverly was alone in a room with every baby that had collapsed. On May 21st, Beverly was arrested on suspicion of murder. She was released on insufficient evidence, but after she moved in with a friend, her kid brother started having attacks. After a near-death experience, Jonathan's blood was tested at the hospital.
And surprise, surprise, Jonathan was made a drink by Beverly Allett before they left for Whittlesea Market, a blackcurrant juice, which he says tasted funny when he was drinking it.
By November 1991, Beverly was in custody again, charged with 4 counts of murder and 7 attempted murders. She had no reaction or emotion to her arrests or charges. In February 1993, she received 13 life sentences. Still, the sentences are to run concurrently, so she became eligible for parole in 2021 after 3 decades behind bars. However, it's unlikely she will ever be released, given her unspeakable crimes. To this day, she has not offered an explanation or apology. Charles Cullen was the youngest of 8 children. Born in New Jersey in February 1960, 2 of his siblings died while they were still children, and his 56-year-old father lost his life when Charles was still a baby. His family struggled financially all their lives. As a child, Charles had to care for his terminally ill brother. When the brother died, Charles went into a deep depression. He was only 9 when he tried taking his life by drinking chemicals from a chemistry set. This set up a disturbing pattern. Charles would try to do this 20 times. But while he never saw his plan through, he began using nursing jobs to take other lives. The final count? Somewhere between 40 and 400. When he was 17, Charles's mother died in a car accident while his sister was driving. Following this last drop, Charles dropped out of high school and enlisted in the U.S. Navy. Charles then served on the attack submarine USS Woodrow Wilson. He then climbed the ranks to become a petty officer 3rd class. But this wasn't his dream. He claims he was severely bullied and dreamed of leaving the ship every day. But it was on the ship that Charles would dress up in surgical clothing and latex gloves and assist the ship's doctor with vaccinations. Then he started doing shifts to cover for the doctor. Everyone admitted he was pretty good at his job as an unqualified nurse. On March 30th, 1984, Charles was medically discharged from the Navy. As soon as he went out, he enrolled in the Mountainside Hospital School of Nursing in Glen Ridge, New Jersey. Within a few years, he was a qualified nurse and a proud husband. In 1987, he married his girlfriend, Adrienne Taub, and they had 2 daughters. But Adrienne never suspected her husband to be an angel of death in the making. In the summer of 2003, the doctors at Somerset Medical Center in New Jersey were worried. Over the last 2 months, 2 patients had been given the wrong medication, and one of them had lost their life. The doctors went on the hospital system and checked the patient's history, as well as all the medication used in their treatment. Soon enough, they found out that on June 15th that year, someone had ordered digoxin, a heart medication that had never been prescribed to the patient. The order appeared as canceled, but the digoxin stock was missing 1 dose. 2 weeks later, a 40-year-old cancer patient went into cardiac seizure for no apparent reason. Her doctor did work and found a huge level of digoxin in her system. Luckily, the doctors were able to administer an antidote and save her life. But why did she have an unprescribed substance in her system? 2 weeks later, a 68-year-old Catholic priest named Reverend Florian Gall wouldn't be so lucky. An autopsy was performed, and once again, huge levels of dioxin were found in his body. This was definitely not an error. The hospital thus launched an investigation.
Levels were astronomical. They're way higher than you would ever shoot for by using the therapeutically.
They were able to track who had ordered the dioxin. One of the nurses, 43-year-old Charles Cullen.
Why did you like Ditch?
Ditch, was a very powerful cardiac medication.
What does it do to someone?
In small amounts, it slows the heart rate down. In larger amounts, it can cause what's called complete heart block. And then the heart is very irregular. And, it can cause death. It does cause death in large amounts.
But Charles had ordered it for his heart patients. He'd also canceled the order, so there was no actual evidence against him. The hospital trust ended the investigation. However, the rumors started circulating in the local newspapers, and the New Jersey Poison Information and Education System warned the hospital that they had an angel of death. That is, a nurse or doctor who poisons their patients.
My number 1, 2, and 3 thought was that there was something malicious going on in the institution.
Dr. Stephen Marcus even urged the hospital to call the police, but the hospital ignored the warning for fear of causing chaos inside the center, or simply because they didn't know who to fire.
This is a police matter. What we're wrestling with is, throwing the whole institution into chaos versus responsibility to, protect patients from further harm.
But every 2 weeks, someone else would die. By October 21st, Charles Cullen had taken 4 more lives and attempted to take a 5th. He didn't care about age, race, or gender. As long as they were easy prey, Charles would go for it and raise his kill count.
Is 40 an arbitrary number?
40 is an estimate. I gave a number between 30 and 40. I think I have identified most of them.
Sadly, the number might be much grimmer, as there were dozens of unexplainable deaths at the hospitals Charles worked at, and there were many hospitals he passed through. Reportedly, his first mass murder attempt was back in 1987. He was 18 years old when he attempted to unalive a group of people with rat poison. 10 years later, he got his first job at the burn unit of St. Barnabas Medical Center. It was the patient's suffering, he said, that made him want to put them out of their misery.
I worked on the burn unit, so there was a lot of pain, a lot of suffering. And I didn't cope with that as well as I thought I would.
And that was the first place that you gave someone medication that caused them to die?
Cullen's first victim was 72-year-old John Yango, a pretty well-known New Jersey judge. He was in the hospital with a severe case of sunburn. He was making a slow but steady recovery when Cullen decided to poison his IV bag. But no one at St. Barnabas linked Yango's death to Charles, or to someone poisoning his IV bag. However, the doctors soon discovered this was happening way too often. Within a year, he attempted to take another 6 lives.
Someone was spiking IV bags with insulin in the storeroom.
Also, Charles saw himself as an angel of death, but John Yango had severe sunburn. He wasn't inches away from death, he was on the path to recovery. This just goes to show how twisted Charles's worldview is. The St. Barnabas staff were convinced that Cullen was responsible for this, but they couldn't prove it. By now, Cullen had a method whenever he would order digoxin.
Wouldn't go in under ditch, I would go under Tylenol or another medication that would be in the same drawer. So, there was no record of me going in for a dig other than the fact that, it was in the same drawer.
So he would access the hospital's computers and order a medication that he knew was in the same drawer as dioxin, carefully covering his tracks. Before he could continue the investigation, Charles quit.
At St. Barnabas, they could have had my license investigated and probably revoked at that point in time.
Should they have?
Should they have? Yes.
Charles himself is quite puzzled at how none of the 8 hospitals he worked at could prove what he was doing. Yet, Charles went on to work at 8 institutions, all in New Jersey, and it took authorities 15 years to catch him. In 1993, Charles's wife filed for divorce. She reported 2 accounts of DV. 2 months later, he broke into the house of a fellow nurse he had dated briefly. Terrified, she phoned 911 and reported Charles. He was arrested and received 1 year's probation. That's when he thought about quitting nursing, but he had to pay child support for his 2 daughters, and he didn't know what else to do. So, after working for 9 months at the Hunterdon Medical Center, Charles got another job at Morristown Memorial Hospital. However, in August 1997, he was fired for poor performance. Then Charles headed to Pennsylvania and got a job at the Liberty Nursing Rehabilitation Center in Allentown. On New Year's Eve, he took the life of 78-year-old Ottomore Schramm. Then he ran off to a different Pennsylvania hospital, unaliving 22-year-old Matthew Mattern. A few months later, he tried to take a 3rd life. Around this time, Charles filed for bankruptcy, as he couldn't pay child support anymore. But with each year, he took more lives. Babies, adults, and elderly patients. Everyone who passed through his rooms risked never coming out. About this time in his life, Charles Cullen simply said, "I just couldn't stop. I couldn't stop." In 2003, in the course of 9 months, Charles took 14 lives and tried taking 2 more. In October of that year, the hospital finally fired him on suspicion of murder. On December 12, 2003, Charles Cullen was arrested as he was leaving a restaurant. He was charged with the murder of Reverend Florian Gall and the attempted murder of Jin Kyung Han, his first attempt. Not only did Charles not resist arrest, but he seemed relieved. He quickly confessed to somewhere between 30 and 40 murders during his 16 years as a nurse. He also confessed to trying to take his life every few years until his arrest.
I tried to kill myself throughout my life because I never really liked being who I was, because I didn't think I was worthy of anything.
Cullen also said that his kill count is just an estimate, as he claims he doesn't remember an exact number or the victims' identities. He pleaded guilty to everything and received 11 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. His shocking case made headlines throughout the country, and everyone wanted to know the same thing. Why?
Was it personal?
No.
Did you get pleasure out of it? Satisfaction?
No, I mean, I thought that people weren't suffering anymore, so in a sense, I thought I was helping.
What about all the young victims who were on the road to a full recovery?
My goal here isn't to justify, what I did. There is no justification. I just think that the only thing I can say is that I felt overwhelmed at the time.
We vividly remember Charles Cullen walking into the waiting room. He looked us right in the eye and stated how Michael was gravely ill and people don't make it. And my wife told Cullen, "That's enough, you can leave now." We're haunted by the memory of Charles Cullen coming to the waiting room to get our reaction.
Does that remind you of someone? That's right, Lucy Letby. An expert explains how the angel of mercy justification is never merciful or empathetic.
It was never about anyone but Charlie Cullen. He did what he did because of his own needs, his own compulsions.
Charles Cullen has always seen himself as a victim, an orphan, a grieving brother, a husband who has lost his children in custody battles, and his money because of his ex-wife. Finally, he thinks he is a victim of poor mental health and crippling alcohol addiction. But the problem is that he thinks being a victim gives him the excuse to inflict pain on others.
And as a victim, he's entitled to lash out in any way he wants to make things right. If that means killing patients, anything justifies his victimhood.
Taking lives was the only time Charles Cullen felt in control. Today, Charles is almost judgmental of the hospitals that let him work, knowing he was harming patients.
So they let me work one more shift, knowing that they were going to fire me the next day. So they let me work an additional shift with the suspicion that I had harmed patients, which is kind of a bizarre thing to do.
The whole case is bizarre to say the least. It's a story about a depressed man who knew he was doing something horrible, yet he didn't want to stop because the system would allow him. But it's more tragic than bizarre. We might never know the true number of lives Charles Cullen took. His 40 victims might just be the tip of the iceberg.
How many do you think?
I would be very surprised, as would pretty much everyone I've spoken to with any knowledge of this case, if it was not in the hundreds, multiple hundreds.
Hey, thanks for watching. What are your thoughts on these cases? Do you know other evil nurses? Let me know in a comment, and before you go, make sure you like and subscribe. See you soon!